Hello and welcome back to Bitcoin with Jake. Today I've got the boys from Blue Collar Bitcoin here, Josh and Dan. Welcome, gents.
Thanks, Jake. We
Pleasure to be here.
Being here, man.
Well, I must confess, this is my first conversation with three of us on the call all at the same time. So a bit of a change in format for the listeners out there, but I'm excited to get the stories of both Josh and Dan. So let's kick off with Blue Collar Bitcoin. If Josh, you want to take it first, but how did you guys first become friends, and why did the podcast start? And what we'll look to do is, work back around. There'll be all sorts of stuff that come out from the initial question, but yeah, let us know how it kicked off.
So I think the best way to start this is I've been ravenously talking about Bitcoin for just over 5 years now. In 2017, I finally got my maybe third touch as to Bitcoin, popping up and me trying to understand what it is and if it's a scam. And I have a background in Austrian economics. So Bitcoin, when it finally landed for me to really understand what's going on here and check under the hood and get it, gold for me had been a sensible investment for a long period of time. And the Austrians, that's just like a go-to investment for anyone who's been into Austrian economics for a long period of time. And when I understood the basics, like this is digital gold and why that is, I was totally down the rabbit hole. I was buying as much as I could reasonably buy it. And in like July of 2017, bought my first bit of Bitcoin and then watched this thing just go ape for the rest of the year. And I was hooked,
What is this thing?
Yeah, exactly. What is this? Why is it going up 10, 20% a month for 6 months straight and then crashing and doing everything that it did in 2018 and 19. And anyway, so I'm talking about this at the firehouse in 2017 constantly. It's the only thing I could talk about. And Dan is the only person that I talked to about it who immediately grasped the significance of this. And so anyway, we talk about this together. We go back and forth on macro econ over the years. And I had somebody tell me, like, you guys talk about this shit so much, or you talk about it so much. Why don't you just have a podcast for an outlet for this? And the first person I thought of was Dan, because Dan totally got it. Probably faster than anybody else I've ever met. And so we decided, fuck it, let's take a shot at it and talk about Bitcoin on a podcast and see what happens. And so far, it's been a fun, very rewarding journey.
Awesome. And Dan, so let us know, like, there's this madman walking around the firehouse, and we'll get to what even a firehouse is, because I don't understand that word per se, but talking about Bitcoin, banging on all day, and you're like, mate, what are you talking about? What was that like as a process?
Yeah. I wouldn't say, I think Josh gives me more credit than I deserve, in the sense that I didn't get it immediately. I think the way I would explain my grasp of it initially was, if it does what he says it does, this is a huge fucking deal. And it's not that I had any level of expertise, but both Josh and I have been students of economics our adult lives. We've been super into finance and econ. So we've had, even pre-Bitcoin, some degree of innate understanding of the fragility of the financial system, how things function, how messy the predicament is. So when he explained basically immutable monetary policy, I knew that if it was remotely workable for the 21st century, it was significant. That sort of thrust me down the learning journey. Initially, it was Andreas Antonopoulos. His book, The Internet of Money, was kind of what really clicked for me, that this needs to be part of my portfolio. The thing I would say about Josh, there is something unique, like, about we're career firefighter paramedics. So it doesn't always hold true, but like, once you get into a good environment on that career path, nobody ever leaves. Like, it's a 30-year career, and it really is a brother and a sisterhood. Like, there's a bond and a tie. And I think Josh and I just immediately, he's been on twice as long as I have been. So I've been on just shy of 6 years. He's been on 10 plus. But when we met each other in this context, it was like, wow, I'm surprised you work here. I wasn't necessarily expecting somebody to be this intellectually wound at the same fire department. And the guys we work with are wildly intelligent. It's are cut from a slightly different cloth. If any of them are listening, they understand, like, they're watching sports every night. Josh and I are tucked in the corner of the firehouse reading a book, right? So
well, yeah,
there's
to interject really quick there. Like, there's also the danger, like there's always a conspiracy guy at the firehouse. So you got to be careful. Like, you can't just believe anything you hear at the firehouse. Like, there's a lot of nonsense floating around. Like, there's a guy who believes in ancient aliens. There's an XRP maximalist. Like, we got lots of characters. So you got to be careful and like hold them at arm's length before you just believe whatever the hell you hear.
I think though, Josh, tell me if you agree with this. What drew us together about doing a project at some point, whether it's this or something else, and who knows what it'll eventually be, is not just the way, and not to, go too hard on this, but not just the way either of us think, but or what either of us think, but how we go about thinking and how intellectually motivated and information hungry the two of us are. So he introduces Bitcoin to me. I go down the rabbit hole in 2017. I mean, with the amount of time we spend, as Josh alluded to, at work and just blabbering, just running our mouths about this thing, it's out of control.
We actually, in 2017, this is no lie, we actually got banned from talking about Bitcoin. It had gotten out of hand to such a degree.
There were literally supervisors that were like, we gotta cut the Bitcoin talk in certain contexts. It got that out of hand. So Josh comes to me. We're basically like, hey man, let's give it a shot. Let's take these conversations to the internet. And
Here we are.
A lot. It's been a tremendous opportunity. We were saying this pre-recording, just to simply to talk to people we never thought we'd have access to. It's been mind stretching, to say it mildly.
And so I'm intrigued. So first of all, whereabouts are you guys based, if you're willing to mention that? And talk me through what it means to be a firefighter paramedic. So as a career choice, why do people end up in this space and how do you get there? So what kind of educational process have you gone through? And really what I'm looking at is people's skill sets. So what does it teach you about the world as a result of going through that process? And that's directed at both of you, obviously. So who would like to take that first?
I'll kick it and then I'll let Josh fill in.
Go for it.
So we're near Chicago. The way the fire service, as it's called in the United States, works, it takes a lot of different forms, but in our area, all of the emergency medicine runs out of the fire department. So there's parts of this country and around the world that don't work that way. The ambulance service comes somewhere different. In our area, the firefighters are the paramedics. So pretty much any firehouse in our area is going to have a fire vehicle, whether that's a fire truck or engine, and an ambulance. And all of the main line staff, the people that staff and run the calls, everybody's a licensed paramedic.
Wow.
So that and I don't know what that means, in the UK or Australia or anywhere else, but that entails getting what's called an EMT basic license and then a paramedic license. We'll call it a 2 to 4 year process. And then at some point you have to go get certified as a firefighter, which is you have to go through a whole academy. So it's two very different jobs, to be honest. And we do both of them. And 70% of our call volume is medical. So despite the fact that everybody's kind of like, oh, the firefighting thing, and we do fight fires, but the day-to-day, if you were to come ride with us, you would say these guys are just medics, like the ambulance calls are the main thrust. So like any career, there's a lot of pros and a lot of cons. I think it is a pretty compelling career. Like, do it, really like it, the two of us included. It's a really unique schedule. We work 24 hours on, 48 hours off. So we're at the firehouse for 24 hours. We sleep there. But yeah, you're living with your coworkers and you're living with them, as I mentioned earlier, for a long time. Like if you get hired with somebody, there's an extremely high likelihood the two of you are going to do 25 or 30 years together. So that is very familial in that regard. It's a hilarious career. Like the relationships are what make it. I mean, coffee at shift change at a firehouse is the most rambunctious environment. It's super energizing, and it's a really fun career. It has its trade-offs. You sleep at the firehouse, anything can come in. We see some crazy stuff, but it's also a very like tactile, right in front of you, rewarding gig. Like you clock in, you respond to people that have any number to the nth degree of issues that happen best. And you're there for the hilarious and the super heavy. And it's a different lens on the world than I think most people have. And at least the two of us are grateful for it.
Brilliant. What an introduction.
Yeah, well
Thank you.
said.
And Josh, so just to sling it to you then, why did you get into this line of work?
I kind of stumbled into it, to be totally honest. I had a friend who went to an EMT class, and I was in college, kind of just figuring out which direction I was going to go. I was going for accounting and realized, holy shit, this is a miserable, at least for me, like my personality, what a miserable line of work. And I still do a little bit of that day to day with the small business I have, and couldn't hate it anymore. And so
it's painful accounting. I agree. God, it annoys me.
I was working at the time at an office, and I'm looking around thinking, like, I'm not going to sit in a cubicle for the rest of my life. I've been doing this for 5 years now. Like, I have to do something more tactile, as Dan said. And this gave me the outlet to have both there's a little bit of an office there too. You have to write a lot of reports. There's a lot of paperwork involved, but for the most part, you're outside, you're doing things, you're getting out into the community, and you're meeting people in some terrible circumstances sometimes, but most of the time it's, you're helping them. So it's a feel good kind of thing. You're always doing something beneficial for other people, and people reciprocate people love firefighters in the United States, especially as opposed to cops. You're never going to get a ticket from a firefighter. Nobody ever gets penalized by a firefighter. We're always helping people. So you're in a position where people, whether or not we deserve it, they admire you to some degree. And we're just helping people. So it just makes you feel good about what you do on a day-to-day basis, especially when you actually can provide some kind of life-saving service to somebody. It feels pretty good. And as Dan said, the schedule's great, and we hang out with usually really fun people who, some of the firehouse jokes, we can't even say them on our podcast.
Yeah, the podcast is massively watered down, folks. Massively.
Yeah,
it may not feel that way.
It's fun. It really is. Like, I don't really ever look at going to work as going to work. It's going there, hanging out with friends. And sometimes you get your ass kicked all night and you don't sleep, but that's why we get 2 days off afterwards. You kind of recover the next day, but it's all good things,
Yeah. I was going to add two quick things. The other advantage to the job is in downtime, when the tones aren't dropping, you can spend hundreds of hours reading and studying Bitcoin.
Yeah. Look at that. Very true. Interesting.
And the other thing
you can on the job, all that. The reading list I've got it gets longer. It doesn't get shorter. Even if you're reading more than you've ever read before, right? You're like bang, 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 bashing out books on a weekly basis.
Exponential curves you walk into, and you're like, okay, I read this, and then this led me to 4 other things.
Correct. That I'd like to especially read, a good book.
And then you've forgotten about them.
Like, sometimes hundreds of different sources for a good book.
True.
Interesting. Okay. So what I'd like to draw on is, and it's an interesting comparison to a police officer, for example. You're not a rule keeper in that sense, and you therefore don't have to abide by arbitrary rules that are made up by some centralized organization that enforced on the local populace in such a way. Like, there's probably all sorts of politics internally that you don't agree with, in terms of, resuscitate someone with a modern drug that you don't need because you can just do it by pushing their heart or something. That's a poor example, but someone who's in the police is telling people off, or like the worst is like traffic wardens. You park your car for 30 seconds because you're literally running a parcel into something, and before you know it, there's a bloke outside giving you $150 fine, and you're like, come on, you prick. Like, seriously, exactly. Just give us a break. You don't come across that kind of antagonistic behavior, which is really nice. And I had something I hadn't considered before, but where I want to take this is this concept of the familial side of your job. So you mentioned the camaraderie. There's clearly like a great relationship between the two of you. Some of the best fun I've ever had in my life, and I'm thinking of sport at this stage, was playing sport at school with mates, like an away game. I played rugby union. It's freezing cold. It's raining, and you fucking win by like a couple of points. And it's like, bang, that's what this is all about. And I'm still friends with those people today, 20 years later. I imagine you get into some crazy situations. There's blood pumping all over the place. Someone's like, crashed a motorbike or something awful. Or equally then there's like a pregnancy and a lady's had given birth in the middle of somewhere like crazy.
Mhm.
I think that kind of relationship with the local community puts you in an incredible position of respect, as you've already explained. But teaching people about Bitcoin is very hard because some reason people are like, nah, this is wrong. It's all a scam, whatever the case might be. So how do you think that that atmosphere that you're in at work translates into your Bitcoin podcast? Does that make sense? And have you been able to influence people into having a look at Bitcoin in a way that they already trusted you and therefore it was easier for them to open the door and look through? Or how's that process been of trying to explain to family and friends about why Bitcoin's important?
So I guess to pick apart the question a little bit.
I mean, sorry,
First off,
it's a bit of a long rambling set of points.
It's a lot of good
no, it was
things.
really good. It was really good.
The first comment I have is that I don't want this to sound hubristic, but within our demographic, Josh and I are unique in that we have some grasp of, we already covered it, finance, econ, and the predicament, to be quite frank, of the middle class and the dynamics at play, right? I think as a result of that, one cool thing about our job is we do have really close relationships with people at work. Everybody's kind of got a thing. So Josh and I would be labeled as like the finance guys, right? But then there's a plumber, there's an electrician, there's someone that's automotive wound. Like everybody's kind of got something that they bring to the table, but you listen to that person. So because trust is built, right, in that familial environment, you can really get through to people, and people are very like receptive. At least a lot of our friends to what we have to say. They're fans of the show. They listen regularly, and they were engaged in our suggestions well before starting the podcast. So that's cool. Like, it's maybe different than the person in the cubicle next to you that doesn't know anything about your personal life, doesn't know the name of your kids. Like we have a connection with our coworkers that's very different than that. And in that sense, their ears are more open to what we have to say, I guess.
Yeah.
The other thing,
that's what I was gonna kind of guess. Basically, was like it's a really interesting position in the community that you're already in, to therefore approach what is a massive subject. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. And Dan, crack on. I cut you off slightly.
The other thing I'll add before I hand it over to Josh, I think being a firefighter paramedic just does make you a problem solver. Like there's not a lot of bullshitting when 911 gets called and it's a real situation. Like you can't really talk your way out of it. You have to figure out the problem, whether that's an odor in someone's house. Is it life-threatening? Is it not? Their house is on fire. You got to put it out. Someone's having a massive cardiac event or a stroke or something else. There's not really a way to, spin move out of these situations. And so firemen do have a propensity to be very matter of fact, cut and dry. What's the point? Get to the point. What's the solution?
Yeah.
That I think Josh and I are, I think that same way. And I think that's bled over into the way that we view markets. There's a problem. It needs to be fixed. What's the solution? I think it also makes us in some ways more just critical of bullshit, even if it's in the Bitcoin community. Like we're in the Bitcoin community, well entrenched, but we also love to talk shit about the Bitcoin community. And so, there's just sort of that matter of fact, objective lens on the world that I think a lot of firefighters carry. And then I guess to add one more thing, like the podcast, our day jobs in general, the nice thing is our lives are oriented around a career that's not tied to Bitcoin. Like this is something that we have actually grown to appreciate, I think, as the podcast has gone on, because I think it allows us to stay more true to ourselves. Sure, we as the podcast scales, that's exciting, but we don't need this at all. And we are we enjoy our fiat jobs and we stack Bitcoin with our fiat jobs, and our lives are oriented around our fiat jobs. And that's a little bit of a superpower in terms of being able to just totally sling it on a podcast. I think, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
I think it also enables us when you're a paramedic and you walk in and somebody's having chest pain or they're having a stroke, you don't have the opportunity to be an introvert. You have to be extroverted, at least pretend to be, in order to interview this person and understand what's going on. Like, when did this start today? How did it start? When, all of the details, what kind of medicine are you on? Like all of these things about their background that kind of incite you to have some idea or some inkling about what could potentially be going on with this person. So, I mean, for myself, I'm introverted by nature. And this podcast and this job have forced me to be more extroverted, even if only in certain periods of time. Definitely helped communication skills, and both the podcast and working at BG or working at the firehouse, they have both influenced me to be more extroverted and just be able to like reach out and talk to people in a more communicative way, like just do a better job at that. And I think that's been beneficial for me, and I think for Dan as well. And those things, it's not for everybody, you know, it can be very challenging at times, but it's definitely bettered me.
It strikes me as, it reminds me of one of my best mates had a girlfriend who was a doctor, and she spent some time in a West Australian accidents and emergencies department. And, you know, and obviously her spare time, she would tell me about what was going on in her day job. And I mentioned to you offline, so my fiat mining role, I work as a shipping broker. So I'm the middleman between mining companies and ships. And it's more akin to like, you know, a central urban trading floor type, you know, everyone's got a few different screens, people walking around on the phone. I've now worked for a number of different companies. Each one has a slightly different culture, but you can have a very stressful day because you miss a deal and your competitor got the deal done and they make, you know, thousands of dollars and you don't. And it's like, fuck. But it's very, very, very different to, you know, someone's in a car crash and comes in the front door. And listening to her explaining some of these experiences, it really struck me as like, fuck, that's a very different type of stress. And the fight or flight mechanism of humans is fascinating. And how actually when you are working in like, if I could boil it down, you're kind of emergency experts. And so, as you mentioned, you have to be extremely extroverted. You've got to communicate with people. You've got to work out fucking quick, what is the main problem here? Categorize the main problem first and react to that and solve it before that causes more issues. At least I assume that's how I would think about it when I turn up.
That's a great way to explain
it. What's the biggest problem here? That's the biggest problem. Solve that first. And it's just so interesting to hear you talking like this. On a Bitcoin podcast. Like, why are we even on a Bitcoin podcast? Like the point
we've lost half the audience, Jake. They're gone.
No, but it's
us now.
You know, it's a cryptocurrency. Like, what the hell's a cryptocurrency? Why are you guys promoting this thing? And I just really find all of that so fascinating. So as a day job, wow, you must have found yourself in some crazy situations. And like, you know, how do you manage those stresses?
I think you could, I mean, what you just said is insanely relevant here, because I think what we're surmising is that we have sized up the biggest problem in the world at the moment, which is the fiat currencies that are indebting the world to a degree that it is an absolute emergency. Like, we need to have people understand this to protect themselves, and getting people to save their money in Bitcoin, at least some percentage of it, even if you don't believe this is going to be successful, save some small percentage of your investable money in this. Because if we're correct, if the Bitcoin community is correct, this is a lifeboat. This is a lifeline to save you from a potential catastrophe of this fiat system. And anyone who's studied money in any capacity over the last eons of human existence, fiat currencies tend to last about 50 years. And that's on average. This one is working its way above 50 years, and it probably will last maybe 10 or 20 more years. I mean, it's hard to say. There's so many more band-aids that could be put on this thing to make it last longer. But this is an emergency to protect yourself and protect your family. And I think the way Dan and I view this is the primary problem in the world right now, at least financially. And this is the best way that we can recommend to people to protect themselves from what is an emergent problem. And that's the reason we do what we do as best we can, is to try to get as many people on boarded as we can to protect them.
Fucking bang, Josh. Right. That's a brilliant statement you've just made. I couldn't agree with you more. And it's so interesting that it comes from a position of an expert in emergencies. Do you know what I mean? That's what I love. I love so much about.
I shy away to be called an
journey.
expert on anything, to be honest.
No,
but
okay,
I appreciate
fair enough. But you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Okay, Dan.
Jake, the other thing I was going to just add there, like this is the difference about our perspective. So at the end of the day, Josh and I are just a couple clowns, just as you are. We
couple of monkeys on a world.
We're constantly changing our minds, revisiting our thesis. Like in one sense, like especially as hosts of a podcast, maybe we know enough to interview people, but we bring no profound expertise like a Lynn Alden, right? What is unique though is that we're actually living these experiences, like as members of the American middle class. And in many regards, all of us that do the job we do are still privileged. We have steady incomes that provide for families, but we have a front row seat to watching the hamster wheel speed up. I mean, even in the 5.5 years I've been on, even since the two of us purchased homes, and we're in our 30s, and this is, 5-7 years ago, but like even since in fairly short order, we're watching the acceleration of that hamster wheel and the impacts of, say, asset price inflation and currency debasement. And then you start just doing some basic zoomed out math on how this system is going to be limped along, which it has to be, because if it's not, you need to have food stores in your basement and start buying ammo. So it's going to be limped along. As it gets limped along, what are the implications? Who's going to be most affected? We're watching the impacts that this has on our demographic. And I think that is different than, say, a financial analyst making a lot more money than we are, who's maybe still putting the pieces together, the impact on the middle class. Well, we're it, right? And that's kind of the voice I think we bring to the space is we're feeling it. We're seeing it. We work with 55-year-old dudes that think they've gotten richer, but when you actually drill down, just because the numbers gone up, but when you drill down the lifestyle of a fireman 30 years ago, it's a lot more work for the same amount of money, or it's less money, but the insidiousness of debasement inflation is a front row seat at a firehouse. When you ask a guy that's been on for 25 years, most of them think they've gotten richer. Factually, they haven't.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of passions that come out of this, just watching the impacts that this has on our demographic.
Insidious is such a good word for this as well. It's just, it's so, sorry. Josh, go for it, mate.
No. All I was going to say is that you have to draw yourself back and realize that most of the world, and this isn't an insult to anybody, because everyone's got an interest that they dive deep down. Ours just happens to be finance. Many other people have many other interests, and they're, quasi experts in whatever that is. But when you hear guys at the firehouse say, like, in the 1992, I got hired and I only got paid $30,000. Like, that sounds like peanuts. But back in 1992, you could have bought a car for, 10 grand. That was brand new. And today, the brand new car is 50 grand. So apples to apples is not the same comparison. But these guys somehow in their mind, they twist that. And if you just look at it on a surface level, very simplistically, 30 grand is a very tiny amount of money, but they're comparing it to today, not 30 years ago. So it's a very, very different proposition that most people just kind of negate. They don't really dive deep enough to understand the apples to apples comparison and understand that, like, no, we haven't kept up with inflation. Even though you might make slightly more than six figures now, that doesn't equate to the same exact thing as, $6,000 in 1990.
And it's
hard.
A really important kind of fact. Like, it's kind of one of the reasons why I think that a lot of people who are very bullish on Bitcoin have a certain skill set that, whether it was a computer science background and they look at proof of work and they think, fuck, they've solved the Byzantine generals problem. That's massive. Or if there's someone with more of a financial background and they're looking at inflation and they're thinking, hang on, I've got to beat inflation. Well, CPI is at roughly 10%. Is that even correct? Where's everything else going? And actually, we've got stagflation at the moment where prices are going up and assets are going the other way. I mean, it's a fucking nightmare. There's different reasons that people come to the asset or the technology, let's call it that help give them a lens. And, being a member of the middle class and seeing your value, your purchasing power eroded over time, This is a fucking massive problem, as you quite rightly point out. And hence, this is why we're all on this call, right? It's because we recognize the same thing. It's like, I need to get as many friends and family to buy this stuff as fast as possible before it becomes more expensive and they get less for the money that they're earning, that they're already going to be able to buy less within a couple of years' time. It becomes like a real vendetta in a sense, and people think you're some kind of religious zealot. It's like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Leave us alone. And so
We've
very
Dan and
careful
I've had
how you temper those subjects. But I'd really like to draw on this conversation, the predicament of the middle class. What is that? And so what are you seeing every day that is a relatable story you can share with some of the people listening?
I think the most obvious one for the two of us is watching guys who have gotten hired in the last couple of years struggling to buy a house. I mean, these guys are struggling mightily to even obtain these guys are bidding $20,000, $30,000 over the asking price of homes and losing because there's so much, well, at least in the last 6 months to a year, there's been so much demand in the housing market in the US. They can't even purchase a home, and they're bidding on 10, 15, 20 different homes before they get one, probably paying a price that's going to look clownish in the next year or two if things, fizzle out the way they seem to be. And it's sad to watch because I'm sitting here thinking to myself, like, they ask Dan and I for advice, and my advice is like, I don't know, man, because if things keep getting more expensive and if inflation keeps up, then it makes sense real estate should probably maintain, if not even gain in value in the next couple of years. But if we see this stagflation, which is what you're talking about, which is very, very likely, and we're probably in the middle of, then asset prices could fall while inflation still rages. So I just don't know exactly what to tell people. It's such a difficult problem for the middle class right now. Is if you need a home, should I buy it? Should I rent? If you rent, you could be pissing money away for a year or two and then find yourself in the same position of having to overpay for a house. It's very difficult. And there's no real guidance for it. Like, nobody really knows how this is going to pan out. And you also don't want to be like, hey man, just go, ape into Bitcoin right now. I mean, it seems like it's a great price. There's every likelihood it goes to 12 grand as it goes to 50 grand. I don't know. There's no way to know. So dollar cost averaging into Bitcoin is probably the best way to do it, which is what we recommend. But there's really no safe place for cash. Like, if you're going to sit on cash, you're losing 10% a year. You're going to buy, I don't know, Bitcoin could go either direction. We don't know. In the short term, Bitcoin's not a good place to put your money, honestly. Like, you could lose 50% of your money in the next 6 months, or you might gain 100%. There's just no way to know. So it's just a real predicament for the middle class, because even guys like us who literally read, eat, and breathe this stuff, I don't even have a good answer for people. It's really tough.
Especially if conviction's not there. I think to caveat what you just said, and I think Josh, you'd agree with this. If somebody really understands the value proposition of Bitcoin, sure, dump a lot of money in if you're ready for a 50 to 80% downturn. But most people aren't ready for that, and they end up biting themselves in the ass. And so that's why I think the longer we've been around this, actually, we are prone to tell people to start small and learn and increase your position size as your knowledge grows. I'm going to take the answer to the question a little bit different angle, because like, I think it's easy and cool to throw, like, yes, currently we're living in 9% CPI and a ton of money because of a pandemic. And they think these things are accurate and they're big problems. But I do think, because the system is going to be prone to be so volatile, because it's so stretched to its limits, you're going to have periods that work back an opposite direction of what people are expecting. Like, it is absolutely feasible that we have a deflationary fit and all these numbers come down and the Bitcoin thesis momentarily looks like it's violated. The point I'm making here is you have to zoom out and say, okay, so what is the middle class predicament?
Correct. And that's what I just on that note, Dan, just lay it out really simple. Like, why is the middle class in this problem?
Yeah. Okay. So this is like such a dense thing to try to summarize, but we'll give it a shot. So basically, and most of the audience will be aware of this, but it's just helpful to kind of rehash.
Yeah, go for it.
We have a system that is built on no reliable metric of value, right? So as you can, I think pretty much anyone can agree that as the last 100 years have marched on, we've moved further and further away from neutral denominations of value. So the supply of money and the price of money is at least partially at the centralized behest of people, right? There's decision makers that are deciding how much money's in the system, how much credit expands, how far it can correct to the downside, which is the real key. And so because we have no reliable peg of value, the amount of debt in the system has reached an unsustainable level. As a result, sovereign nation states will default. We're at a level of indebtedness internationally. This is not specific to one country. We're at a level of international indebtedness that, aside from us uncovering, nuclear fission or something completely out of the box, like, nation states will default. And as Greg Foss says, which I love, like, the error term in the fiat debt equation is the currency itself. Summary is the number of units in the system will continue to go up over time. Okay. That spells a couple different things, but the primary issue is that when markets continue to be rescued to the downside in moments of deflation and deleveraging, we have seen a propensity over time for asset price inflation to run rampant. And the asset holders tend to be the upper tiers, right? The upper class, the upper middle class, or responsible middle class members who've saved and have a good portion of their net worth and assets. But it's less common the further you go down the wealth spectrum for people to have a large proportion of their net worth in something that's going to keep pace with the number of increasing units in the system. People that are paycheck to paycheck, it's incredibly unlikely that wages are going to keep up with the number of units that are going to have to be introduced to keep the system together. And I think you have to draw an analogy to the individual. So if some of what I just said made no sense to somebody, if you have a bunch of shit you can't afford, right? You've got a fucking boat outside you can't afford. You got 2 nice cars, a house that's way bigger than it should be. You can go bankrupt as an individual. But if you have a printer in your basement that can print the units that your debt is denominated in, you're never going bankrupt. You are always going to make good on those debts. And that is where nation states are at, because they control the currency. The number of units is bound to go up. You have to protect yourself. There's nothing more pristine in our mind than Bitcoin to protect yourself, which we can get into later. But that's how I would describe the predicament. And it's especially poignant for particularly a career firefighter who is largely reliant on a pension denominated in fiat currency, right? They don't have assets. They're relying on a promise to get paid a certain amount of fiat. And as that debasement escalates over time, that contract that they have to get paid in fiat is going to become less and less and less valuable, and lifestyle is going to come down with it. Yeah. That's my best stab at summarizing just the economics behind the predicament.
Dude, you did a great job of summarizing that. And it's extremely important that people understand the fine point that when you say a country defaults, it doesn't mean they default in regular terms. It doesn't mean they go bankrupt and lose everything. It means because they are the sovereign, they have the ability to print the money. And that means, like Greg Foss said, like you said, and we have to highlight this, the error term is the money, which means they will print it ad infinitum and they will devalue it, which is your money, which is your savings, which is your lifeblood, your essence leaving your bank account by inflation. So it's imperative for people to understand this. And I think really what it comes down to is like, what is the best thing to put your money in order to defend yourself against that? And arguably, in my mind, what I'm doing, I'm going to buy Bitcoin. And maybe if you're more conservative, you buy gold or something more commodity based. As Lyd Alden has alluded to, this is likely to be the decade of commodities rising in price significantly. And what that reflects is the actual money, the FX market losing value, but because everything it's such a strange quasi world of they're all inflating together. So they don't really show or reveal it. What they reveal it against is natural gas prices, gasoline prices, the price of Bitcoin, the price of gold, all these commodities that you're familiar with, Jake, as you do this on a day-to-day basis. I mean, shipping is going to get a lot more expensive in 5 years.
Correct.
That's a pretty safe assumption, I'd say.
Yep. What's interesting about that is, just to talk about my line of work for a moment. So the commodities demand is very, very strong, right? With growing population sizes, people need things, right? They got to grow stuff. They've got to move what they grow, or they're going to dig it up and move it and burn it. What is interesting, though, is that there's no one in the shipping space that's really connected inflation and money printing to asset prices, in my opinion. All they talk about all day long is supply and demand. And it's basically like, look, next year there's going to be this many tons of iron ore on the oceans versus the year before, because the producers are going to put the production numbers up. So yeah, to me, it's when you're looking at this as you guys are, and I'm very, very similarly aligned, no one's really made that connection. It's like, look, the cost of freight's going up, and that's not because the supply and demand's changing, which is the traditional metrics that people look at. It's actually because the money's disintegrating, and it's just going to cost more dollars to move a ton of iron ore from Australia to China. Lynn makes a great point, and I think she's right. The point is more and more monetary units enter the system as governments are bankrupt and they're debasing away their own debt. Then hard assets like commodities are going to increase in price. It's very natural, or seemingly natural reflection of the situation we're in. What I love, though, about what you guys are explaining, and in a sense, I'm in the same boat. There's lots of kind of Bitcoin influencers who are, they're career investors, and they were analysts at banks or hedge funds or different asset managers, and they've looked at equities and bonds and FX and all the rest of it, and their job was to manage someone else's money, right? They get paid management fees for funds that have a 2 and 20 carry, or whatever different structure they have, a 1% per year management fee for discretionary management of an equities portfolio, however it might be structured. At the end of the day, the business is connected to being paid to manage money. As the middle class, it's your fucking money, right? And that's a big difference, because you don't get paid regardless of performance. I mean, the 20% carry that a VC fund might gain is very much a performance related kickback. But a wealth manager or financial advisor who's making 1% per year on assets under management, if it goes down by 10%, they're going to turn around and tell you, oh, the markets are down this year. Still get paid, right? Whereas when you're getting squeezed in the situation we explain, where the stagflation going on, you're fucked. It's like, how do I find the best way to store my energy, my time, my money for my kids and for my grandkids? And it's a very different mentality, I think. And that's why it's almost more powerful when someone who's in the situation they're in the middle class, and turns around and says, Bitcoin's the right option for me, for my family. And I actually personally believe that Bitcoin is going to prove to be the most important family wealth management strategy tool ever invented. And it's pretty simple. You don't need to do anything, but you can save money again and buy Bitcoin, and on you go. And so, I love the fact that you're living the problem, and this is the problem that you feel is most important to solve as experts at looking at problems. And then to say, actually, I think it doesn't necessarily matter about what professional investors think. It's about how you perform with your money. I'm kind of ranting about my own situation at this point, but I really resonate with a lot of what you've said. And it's funny how some people put their head in the sand and they go, okay, I don't know what's going on with the money. Something's not quite right. The secondhand car that I bought a year ago is now more expensive because I want to buy a different one because it's not quite right. Normally cars go down. Oh, fuck it, I'll just buy it anyway. And they don't really want to look at it properly. And other people are like, hang on, so what are you talking about here? Okay. And then they kind of engage with you. Anyway, I mean, anything you want to draw out of what I just said? Because I don't necessarily have a question to follow up on with, but sometimes that happens, right? You get on a bit of a tangent.
I love that. And what it brought to mind for me when you were going through that was, this is a thought that's kind of a tangent on what Tour de Meester had been about the printing press in Bitcoin, but it almost alludes to the printing presses to the book as Bitcoin is to the internet. Like, the internet obviously has a ton of value. It's produced a ton of value. Google, Amazon, all these companies have flourished on it. But Bitcoin was the instantiation of the pivotal tool that the internet was providing humanity, just as the printing press back in the 1400s produced books that disseminated throughout and changed people's minds and allowed people to actually understand fundamentally for themselves, what does the Bible actually say? And the internet has produced Bitcoin, which is, what is our money actually made of? And these are fundamental, pivotal moments in humanity, I think, on a scale that I don't think we really appreciate fully. It's quite astounding.
I don't think we do appreciate it fully either. Go for it, Dan.
Yeah. So there are very few, like if you understand a little bit about the financial sector, you recognize that the average huckleberry does not have access to that many exciting things. Like we don't, the average firefighter doesn't have access to preferred shares and private equity and all these amazing opportunities. And certainly our thesis could be wrong. And we could sit here 15 years from now and say, wow, we got that wrong. But in our view, with our two eyes and the brain that we've been given, Bitcoin seems like in my mind, the soul, the soul unique. It's an incredibly unique opportunity. Like the longer that I study this thing, awestruck I am by it. You have something solving two massive problems at once, right? You have something that can provide censorship resistant digital bare final settlement for humanity. In and of itself, that discovery is incredible. The second discovery being the discovery of absolute fucking scarcity, right? So you combine totally immutable monetary supply with a bare asset that is 21st century proof. This thing is an unbelievable innovation. The three of us obviously agree. We're on a freaking Bitcoin podcast. But and Josh, you've said this before, the degree to which the average even person that is in finance for a living misunderstands what this even is. It's not that they've studied it and disagree with it. It's that 4 sentences in, you recognize, holy shit, this person doesn't even understand what this is, what it's doing, what it has the potential to do, and then the degree to which it is misunderstood. Though the confluence of those factors is what creates such an incredibly dramatic opportunity. And I think we also overestimate how much this has infiltrated society. Like when you hear people talk about 150 million users and umpteen% of people using it, the usage of Bitcoin is incredibly shallow. Like someone that has, I think Lynn wrote this in her most recent piece, someone that has $220 worth of Bitcoin on Coinbase from 4 years ago that they've forgotten about, that person's not substantially into Bitcoin, right? As people recognize what this is and the foil that it is to the current system and the potential insurance it provides to the current system, and usage becomes meaningful across hundreds of millions to billions of people. And then you start doing the math on 21 million finite supply, Metcalfe's law, and the network just continuing to grow. It is a mind fuck. I mean, the numbers that this thing could reach, the asymmetry potential is truly unbelievable. And they're just, back to my original point, there are just not many opportunities like this for the average person. If you don't have access to all this preferred stuff.
And this thing is alive. It's, it's evolving. It's moving. It's not like this is a commodity that just sits there like gold. Gold is something that it is what it is. It's physically and atomically gold. Bitcoin is non-physical. It's just software. It responds through the developers to problems or issues, and it changes, and it gets more private, and second and tertiary layers make it better over time. Like this thing is just in its first innings, and we don't even know what it'll be 15 or 20 years from now. I mean, we do know there will be 21 million units. We know that for sure. We do know it'll be immutable. It'll remain and retain all of the characteristics it has, but it also can be exponentially better over a period of time, better than and different than we can even predict, because of all these different layers that will be applied to it and are currently being applied to it. And it's easy to forget that 3 years ago, I remember looking at this very recently. The Lightning Network was like 6 different nodes being run by developers. Like the star, like we all seen that star chart of lightning with this ridiculous spread that looks like you're looking into the night sky at night. Well, 3 years ago, that was like
6
to 10 nodes. I mean, this thing is growing incredibly
Yeah.
quickly, and this is only one part of one of the tertiary layers that will eventually exist. And then Taro and all the other things that are building on that.
It's so
It is
fascinating. isn't
truly mind blowing how quickly this thing's moving. And
So-
it feels slow, but it's moving fast.
Yeah, well, especially when you get very close to it and you see that actually a lot of the leading voices in the space, they're all the same. You know, all the events have got the same people at. There's actually, you know, very little space between, like, here we are talking, and it took, you know, shout out to Daz for introducing us. Like, you're one connection away from talking to other people that seemingly have followings or whatever. It doesn't take long to reach out to the community, and I think that's a very good signal as to how small it still is. And a couple of things spring to mind that I think are really cool. So first of all, this concept of a high net wealth investor. There's essentially an arbitrary set of requirements to enter certain investments, or you have to be regulated, right? So you've done all of your financial exams. So there's a number of assets out there that the average person on the street, and I love this concept of the pleb culture. Like, a pleb sounds like something it's not a good thing, but actually the Bitcoin space, like, people really own it. The idea of being a pleb, you're Bitcoin. I'm just a bloke who's, or a female for that matter, but like, I've just read up about Bitcoin. I believe in it and I'm buying some. I'm just a fucking Bitcoin pleb, whatever. You don't need to be qualified. You don't have to show your high net wealth statement, but you're buying into something that's truly, it's a phenomenal innovation. And so this idea that you can circumvent these arbitrary government regulations, that's a win. 2, there's all of this institutional money that's regulated. They're not even allowed to buy Bitcoin, even if they wanted to.
Beautiful.
So you can front run these pigs, right? That for years have created rules to beat you. They have their own money printer. They have all their own regulations, and you can sneak around them, and you can buy a small piece of a network that cannot be debased. And that is so unbelievably exciting. And the whole phrase of the more you know, the more you buy, I don't know how that applies to anything else more so than it does with Bitcoin. So, for example, I went through a period of investing into startups, and I was really excited by this concept of breakout hockey stick growth, buying early stage equities in software businesses that, you know, go on to become Google. And it's a really fascinating space and had a particular lens on sustainability. And I was looking at all sorts of cool stuff. But at the end of the day, the closer you get to a startup, the more problems you see with it, which is it's still a tiny team that isn't a profitable business, that has potentially a huge market size, but a ton of competitors. That means that the more you know, the more risky, in a sense, your investment actually is. And hence you diversify. So you buy 10, 15, 20, 25 different small investments in early stage companies. And that's how you then, you know, hedge your risk. And so there's an opportunity here for the average pleb to just do a bit of reading, do a bit of research, and front run a whole bunch of people that cannot physically get their money in ahead of you. This is an unbelievable opportunity. And the last point to that being, I read a great article yesterday from back in 2014. It's on the Nakamoto Institute, and it talks about Bitcoin as Bitcoin and entrepreneurship. And Bitcoin will not survive without entrepreneurship. So there are going to be some companies out there that are necessary for Bitcoin to survive. But in the article writes that the average person, by buying Bitcoin itself, is going to do more to support the network and have a better upside than investing in the business. Because without Bitcoin, there is no Bitcoin business. And so with Bitcoin, you've got the upside of all of the businesses that are being built on Bitcoin in a way that's never happened before. And so what they described it as was actually almost like altruistic philanthropy. So you're not doing an early stage equity investment in a Bitcoin business. You buy Bitcoin, and with 5% of your stash, you just chuck a bit of cash at some Bitcoin businesses to help support the network. And this is a fundamental change in thinking that is just not possible for, you know, VC funds. They can't do that. So yeah, there's a bunch of reasons why, and to echo all your points, that this is a particularly exciting opportunity. And I'm, you know, very passionate about telling people about it. It's awesome, isn't it? Gosh, I mean, think about your point. Where's it going to go? Who knows?
It is, to piggyback on what you just kind of alluded to, is it is like buying piece of TCP/IP, right? In like 1990 or whatever. Like it's there's nothing to quite compare it to, but thinking about a base layer protocol with exponential potential and application that you can buy a piece of the base layer. It's the first instantiation, probably the first and last instantiation of the internet of money. And a lot of people haven't connected the dots on what that means for the value of the base layer units.
Yeah.
And then you talked about VC stuff with competition. Yes. Like unbelievable ideas. Profound innovation is going to be saturated with competition. And that's what makes Bitcoin so unique. The longer I look at it, the less competition I see it having, right? There really is going to be only one digital bearer form of money tied to something in the real world, right? That being the proof of work mechanism, which I believe firmly is totally necessary for this thing to function reliably, which is the whole value proposition. Liquidity, growing network effects. There's not anything that's going to step in as a real competitor. In my view, I'm eyes wide open, always looking for it. But that's what makes this a unique investment too, is it's by its nature, really, there can only be one thing solving this problem, you could say. And this is that thing. And as time goes on, it looks better and better on a risk adjusted basis. And that it seems more and more likely as liquidity flows in and innovation skyrockets that this is the answer to this problem.
Jake, as you said, number one, you don't have to be in the United States. We call them accredited investors. Right. You don't have to be an accredited investor. There's no reason. You don't have to take any exams. You don't have to have a net worth of $1 million plus. So you have the barrier to entry here is zero. You can buy $25. You can buy $10 million, whatever you'd like. Number two, the addressable market for this is literally everything. I mean, it's parts of the art market. It's parts of real estate. It's parts of the bond market, very likely. Yeah.
It's part of the bond market.
Literally everything. Yeah. So we've got an upside that's quite literally unlimited right now, quite insanely unlimited with no barrier to entry. There's just no other investment like this. Nothing like it, not even close. I mean, especially not in the crypto world. The crypto world is a clown show at this moment. And we're watching half of it blow up. But this is just a screaming buy at anything near these prices in my mind. Like I've been trying to buy as much as I can reasonably buy without putting myself into a tent or something.
Without your wife going, why the fuck is there no money in the account?
Exactly.
Well, gents, 1 hour is coming closely to completion. I feel like we could go for multiple, to be honest. I'm going to take a question. I asked if anyone had any questions for you guys on Twitter, and there's one that's just made me laugh. So CMK, I don't know this character, but perhaps you guys do. How do you catch a slippery hog?
Oh, man.
The hog references.
Yeah, what is that? You have to explain that to me.
This has just been something that naturally occurred. I don't even know when. Maybe on our, I don't know, first few episodes, we started joking about how Bitcoin is a slippery hog. Like you just can't get your hands around it. You can't catch it. It's running away because it's always all over the place. It's just one of the, I don't know, anthropomorphizing this thing that exists that we just can't understand ever. The rabbit hole never ends and the slippery hog never gets caught. But it's just something we constantly refer back to on our show as a joke. And I don't know how to catch a slippery hog. If I did, I'd be rich.
Yeah. The hog has become larger than life.
Yeah.
I think at first, Josh, I think maybe the first time we used it, we were talking about it from like a regulatory framework. We actually talked about this with Natalie Bernal this last week
was it with Brett?
Essentially regulation is like a bait and switch. They're regulating a current version of an open source programmable protocol that's going to look a lot different in 15 years from like a privacy, fungibility, trackability perspective. And I think maybe one of the first times we used it was talking like, it's going to be hard to get for regulators to get their hands around the slippery hog. Like he's just going to squeal away,
Yeah.
But yeah, we don't even know what the hog means anymore. We just are constantly throwing out swine references.
I like analogies though. It helps. Like it really helps you think through things, and also historical context. You mentioned the printing press earlier in Tour de Mister. Looking at history and understanding when certain innovations arrived and the impact they had on society that's actually an incredibly useful way of thinking about how profound Bitcoin is, like the invention of the wheel or Bitcoin. Breedlove's talking about zero and the invention of zero and how important that was. Like, whoa, what the fuck is that? You never even think about what life was like without a zero. Like, what do you mean? There was, like, do you know what I mean? And that kind of stuff really gets you thinking. And so the slippery hog, okay, got you. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? Like, how do you catch a slippery hog, boys? Like, come on.
At least on the level of Tour de Meester and, Robert Breedlove's zero. Like, I think the slippery hog is at least as relevant. Minimum.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure that the coffee breaks in the firehouse have heard plenty about slippery hogs. Well, Jen, so final question. So, where can people get in touch if they want to reach out?
On Twitter, we are at blue_collar BTC. We're on there more than we should be. Our wives would definitely attest to that.
Yeah, it's addictive
Blue Collar Bitcoin and Blue Collar Bitcoin podcast. We're all the major podcast platforms. We're on the 2.0 Lightning stuff too, like Fountain and Breeze. Yeah, if you want to shoot us an email, bluecollarbitcoinpodcast@gmail.com. And we're here learning and exploring with everybody else. Have no answers, but we talk to people that do, and we're just a couple humble plebs, Jake, just making our way.
No, brilliant. No, some firehouse plebs that are asking the great questions. I think this is something I'm very passionate about as well. It's like, it's okay to ask questions. Like, somehow we live in a world where, like, what does that mean? Or why are you doing that? Or, well, that doesn't make sense. Why? These questions are like, no, just trust us, is the more and more the rhetoric. And so, yeah, fuck yeah. Let's ask as many questions as we can and learn along the way. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, we don't have a clue. And most of our guests don't either, even if they pretend they do.
Yeah, we're all actors. Okay, boys, Josh and Dan, thank you so much for your time today. Couldn't appreciate it more.
Thanks, Jake.
Thanks for having us.
Pleasure.